So we got the question on Facebook, how does one become a psychoanalyst? So we thought we would share, have a discussion around that for a few minutes. And we're all have different backgrounds and trainings. So I'd start with mine. You know, I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst. And even saying that you're a Jungian psychoanalyst is a bit of, some people might say it's even a bit misguiding, because when you actually train to become a Jungian psychoanalyst in Zurich, psychoanalysis in itself is a term that's very closely still associated to Freud and the conflicts that happened back in the days between Jung and Freud. And most of what you read around more classical psychoanalysis in Zurich is very much colored still by this conflict. So it's definitely not psychoanalytic training in that sense. It's a Jungian training. And if you want to call yourself a Jungian psychoanalyst, as I do myself, I have felt it in my own career that I've had to sort of, go outside of the Jungian field to really get a better understanding of the traditional psychoanalytic theory and such. But the question, how does one become a Jungian psychoanalyst or a Jungian analyst then? Well, some people like myself, they go to the source, and the source then being Zurich, where Jung worked and lived through his whole life, 1875 to 1961, in Küsnacht, outside of Zurich. And there's an institute there, the Jungian Institute. But as often happens in the psychoanalytic and in the Jungian field, there are fights and institutional conflicts. And this Jungian Institute then later became two. So there's two ways to train to become a Jungian psychoanalyst in Zurich. There is the Küsnacht Institute, the Jung Institute, and there is the ISAP Zurich Institute, which is sort of, which were born out of a conflict with the old institute, but which have been around for about 20 years. The difference between these two institutes is that the more traditional and more classical Jung Institute, where I did not train, in Küsnacht, very close to where Jung's house still stands and where his grandson now lives, is a program where you don't actually have to live in Zurich, but you go to Zurich 2 to 3 times a year. So you can actually be in your own city, wherever that is. I could have been in Berlin, doing my analysis in Berlin, but then going to sort of immersive lecturing and workshops and colloquias and meetings with your admission committee down in Küsnacht in Zurich. And that training is then a training for, I think the fastest you can do the training is 4 years. There's some sort of turbo people who manage that, but I'd say an average of training is around 6 to 7 years actually. And what the training is then built around a theoretical block. So the first 2 years that you only study theory and you do your personal analysis. Yeah. So you might have your analysis in your hometown, then you go to Zurich for the theory, for the lectures and such. After 2 years, if you then have passed what's called the propaedeuticum exams, where you are tested on theory in different fields such as dreams, myth and fairy tales, clinical work and clinical intervention, psychiatry, and such. There's different blocks. And if you pass the propaedeutic exams, you then meet with your admission committee, which consists of senior analysts that then are also there to sort of evaluate your progress. And a lot of the emphasis, most of the emphasis, I would say, still in the Jungian training is put on the personal analysis. That does not mean that your analyst, hopefully, discusses, with the admission committee what has happened in the analysis, but the emphasis is lying on that you do your, own analytical process, your own individuation, if you like, using a Jungian term. So that's also, after you have done these 2 first years of training, you have to collect a certain amount of hours of personal analysis also before you are allowed to see any patients, of course. So then after 2 years, if you pass the propedeutikum exam, you can start meeting patients, but you also have to do clinical internships at a psychiatric clinic. I think it's around 3 months of a clinical psychiatric internship that you need to have experience of. And of course, when and if you then start working with patients, you have to have supervision for every X hour of work with your patients. You're only allowed to have a certain amount of patients. You're only allowed to charge a certain amount for those patients. And you're also obliged to take and partake in colloquias for those years. And that's why it depends, if you go on the turbo route, or if, some people, it takes longer time to build up a practice and, keep a practice going. Because at the end of what's called the diploma candidate phase, so after you have done the propedeutikum, you become a diploma candidate. So at the end of that, you have to do another round of theoretical exams. You have to have regular meetings with your admission committee, and there is also a thesis that you have to write, like an academic paper that has to be presented and approved by your admission committee. And then you have to have done X amount of hours of supervision again, clinical colloquia, and own personal analysis. So usually then after 6 to 7 years, you are at the point where you can then get licensed, or I should say certified as a Jungian analyst. And that might be another discussion, but to be a Jungian analyst, that might mean something. Then if you train in Zurich, that might give you some validation and licensing in Zurich or in Switzerland, but it doesn't help you much if you maybe move back to Spain, or if you move back to Berlin in Germany. You are sort of a Jungian analyst and you can call yourself that, but you cannot call yourself a psychotherapist or a psychologist or anything like that. So now I spoke about the traditional program in Küsnacht. Then, as I mentioned, there's also this split of institute where I train, which is called ISAP Zurich, which follows a very, very similar model. If not, I would say actually, no, it follows the same model. The big difference being that you have to be in Zurich. Zurich is a lovely city, and it's a wonderful place to be if you're rich or if you can afford it, because it's a very expensive city still, and analysis, supervision, and such cost a lot of money. So that speaks maybe against it. But I think what ISA, for example, emphasis is the sort of immersion, that it's an immersion, and it's not online. You're there in person, and you live your life there. You have your analysis in Zurich, and you should have your patients there as well. So if you're looking at that route of training, you have to look at moving to Switzerland and being there for X amount of years. There is also another version of that program where you can, after a few years, do some of the work on a distance, but that means also that you need to do more analysis, and it's a longer commitment. I can share more details later, but maybe I leave over to one of you, Ada, if there are questions.
Yeah, I wanted to, and I hope it's not too much echo for this to become legible, but I'm thinking of like how the three of us have had different experiences in training, but that there are certain things, I think, even if it's a Jungian, Lacanian, or a proper International Psychoanalytic Association training, that are common to them, that I think it would be important maybe to settle down in order for the people who are watching this video to know that all the places that I know where you can train as any kind of analyst, you have to be analyzed. You will have to actually be the patient of a senior analyst. You will have to do some sort of a theoretical educational work, as it's seminars and write tests and papers and etc. And you will have a practical arm to all this, which would be in different formats, some sort of a psychotherapeutic practice that is also supervised by an analyst of your institute or your association. Another thing in common is the fact that psychoanalytic training happens outside the university context is institutional, and usually these institutions, according to their theoretical affinity, doesn't matter what school they are, what school of thought they are, they seem to be united as well, not only nationally. So I was wondering, I mean, the two schools that you mentioned in Zurich, they also form part of some sort of a world association, etc. No? And I think this is basic, and it's already. I was wondering before. There are a couple of texts in Freud where he starts kind of drawing certain lines about what being an analyst is and how do you become an analyst. And it's not the same to read the text and start interpreting the unconscious to people. There is a famous paper of Freud on lay analysis, which precisely speaks about that. And there, these three lines of work are already drawn, maybe a draft, but you need it to be analyzed. You need to do the theoretical work, like the classroom kind of work, and you need to practice, but under supervision. And I think this is common to every school in the world. I don't know any that does. I don't know any school in the world, but I don't know any that doesn't follow those, at least those three paths in parallel. Yeah, but what is I could tell you about my experience, which is also a bit special. In Chile, there is two main psychoanalytic institutes, and one of them being the official one, meaning the one that belongs to the IPA, or the International Psychoanalytic Association, which is an association that Freud and company invented around 1911 or 1910, and there were some, you will find, maybe not only in psychoanalysis schools, but in postgraduate schools of psychotherapy in general, there is a lot of political rivalries forming, or theoretical ideas that seem to be contradictory to one another. And many of these events end up in the split of the institute. So it's probable that the institute where you studied, Jakob, was at some point, these people were part of the other one, the official one. And then they split because of differences that could be theoretical or even personal. Same thing happened in Chile when I studied. I didn't study in any of those institutes, to be honest, but I got my supervision with the director of one of the institutes, but was independent because I wanted to train as a Lacanian analyst. And as it happened with Jung, also Lacan didn't have problems with Freud personally, because they didn't meet each other, but he did have problems with the establishment of psychoanalytic institutes in Paris in the mid 20th century. And he invented his own institute that then he fought with the people of that institute, and then created yet a third one in Paris. And that means different associations of these institutes around the world. The big difference, I would say, the Lacanian training has to with regards to more traditional psychoanalytic training is the device of the pass, it's called, in which when your analysis ends, you and your analyst, after years of being on the couch, decide that this is enough, that we got to an end. You get interviewed by a couple of analysts of the association you want to belong to, and your analyst as well. And then these people who interviewed you, they kind of put together a history of your analysis, a thing that you also have to do. And then you have to read this in front of the people of the association who want to come to this right. And of the two people who interviewed you, one is going to defend the end of your analysis, and one is going to try to make it trick. And in the end, by consensus, usually, I've never seen a pass being rejected, but I know of some, I've never seen it. You get accepted into this association. In the case of Chile, for example, that doesn't bring anything but the membership to the association. Because in that country, the license of psychotherapist is something that a university gives you when you study psychotherapy at university, which is a thing that I did. Another important thing that happens, for example, in all the schools of psychoanalysis in Chile, I don't know the Jungian school, to be honest, but with the psychoanalytic ones, I mean, more traditional psychoanalysis ones, is that anyone can go and start a training of analyst, even if you're not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or any professional. You could be an architect. But at least in Chile, you can do until year 3 or 4. And just to do the theoretical bit, the classroom bit, but not to see patients. I know that this changes in different countries. That some countries get only psychologists, some countries get only psychologists with a postgraduate degree, other people just medical doctors, etc., etc. Is it different in the places that you studied?
Well, in Zurich, you don't have to be a psychologist. You need to have a master from university. So there are, I would say, I cannot say the percentage, but there are many psychologists who have that background who go to Zurich to study and then become an analyst. There are also quite a few psychiatrists and medical doctors. There's also quite a few priests, pastors, and theologians who are looking to do pastoral work or pastoral counseling and such. So that's, but there is this opportunity or option for people like myself who did not study psychology at the university to still go through a training to become a Jungian psychoanalyst. Again, that doesn't make me a psychotherapist, for example, in Germany, but it gives me the right to use the title, a Jungian psychoanalyst. And I think I should just add to that, because you're completely correct, Nicholas. This is just the same in the Jungian world, that there is then an international association. In this case, it's called IAAP and AGAP. And they are then operating a system of certification for institutes that are then in different countries. For example, there is an institute in Denmark, there are institutes in UK, in US, in most parts of the world, actually. So you don't have to go to Zurich, and that's not a necessary to go to that place to train to become a Jungian analyst.
I don't think I have much to add, because this is, as the two of you have already mentioned, quite similar in different schools. I trained in Belgrade. At the beginning of my training, this was called Belgrade Psychoanalytic Study Group. Over time, it became a component society of the International Psychoanalytic Association. And the basic training is within this 3-part model. I had my personal analysis, and the IPA requires at least 4 years, at least 4 sessions per week. So I had 4 sessions every week on the couch for several years. I've never met anyone who finished in 4. Everyone took longer, and I'm hearing more and more often, especially I think from American colleagues, that people have 2 or 3 analyses later in life. I had 2 supervisions. One was for 4 years with a person who also was on the couch 4 times per week. The other one was for 2 years with a person who was on the couch 3 times per week. And there were theoretical seminars, which mostly, and I liked that, were not focused on authors, but on problems like development, psychopathology, psychoanalytic technique, and similar things. And there were those interviews that were already described before the beginning, after 2 years, before the first supervision, before the second supervision. And then in the end, you have to write 2 very detailed case presentations of these 2 persons that you analyzed and were supervised for that work. And you have to present whole sessions. I think 3 whole sessions of both cases. I'm not sure now about the number. And then again, there is a committee that you discuss this with, and they decide whether you're ready or not. But I think basically it's all the same story. Possibly we're reading different papers, because I don't think I read a single paper by Jung in my training, and I don't think I read a single paper by Lacan in my training, but there was a lot of Winnicott and a lot of Klein. I assume that's the major difference. Other than that, it's basically the same story, I think. Many years, a lot of money, even more time. In the case of personal analysis, very intense, at moments painful emotions, and a huge importance, I think, of the first supervision, which basically introduces you to how to keep the setting, how to recognize transference, and these basic steps you make with the help of the first supervisor. But basically, that's okay.
Do you also have to? Did you also have to do internship in a psychiatric clinic or such, or is that a part?
I personally did not, because I studied psychology, and immediately, like 2 or 3 months after I finished, I started working in a psychiatric hospital. But psychologists who didn't had to spend 1 year, and people from other disciplines who wanted to be trained had a completely, like, an added propedeuticum part where they had to learn about psychopathology and so on, and to have an internship. So for them, it takes longer, but it's possible.
I mean, should we say something about this motto of Berlin Psychoanalytic, psychoanalysis should be free, that has been interpreted in different ways, understandably, and now we're talking about the sort of hard realities and the cost of a psychoanalytic training. And here we are with our little project and screaming psychoanalysis should be free. And I mean, yes, what we've been wanting to free is psychoanalytic education and making people come in contact with the theory from what we studied from our respective fields. But I think the comments sometimes in YouTube is asking about the actual cost of this training, and just in the Jungian world, I can just share that it's a huge problem, because we have a difficulty in getting a new generation to go through this process. And what I'm also noticing is online now, many different type of sort of private, let's say, initiatives, or I wouldn't call them institutions, but training programs where they offer, for example, a Jungian training program in a year for, let's say, psychologists or psychotherapists. So we then find, maybe someone today calling themselves a psychologist with a Jungian orientation, for example, or we find someone calling themselves a psychoanalytic counselor. So I'm just thinking about this, the difficulties and the money, and if we have something, if you have any thoughts around this, as we're sort of claiming this vision of a free psychoanalysis.
It's expensive everywhere, I think, unfortunately. And that's not good, because some of the best candidates cannot afford it. And psychoanalysis is suffering from a huge brain drain, unfortunately. And then it is not a good development, because psychoanalysts, once you get there, usually live very comfortably and are not interested in anything revolutionary, subversive, any major changes, because their lives are usually very affluent and comfortable. So that's one dimension. I know it very well, because I started my training several months after the end of bombing and wars and everything. And people know it, whoever I spoke with, wherever they came from, they know it, because sessions and trainings are expensive. I would just like to add, at least in a sentence, that's just one part of the liberation that is necessary. I believe training programs need much fresh air in terms of reading contemporary literature, problem-oriented, problem-solving oriented, science-oriented, and so on, and less of this religious approach, like Freud said. So what if he said? Let's see what the world looks like today. So there are two dimensions, I would say, to this.
Yeah, well, I also, I didn't do my training in London. I studied my postgraduate in London within a psychoanalytic school within a university. And the people I met there, I mean, I never met anyone who was younger than 40 years old starting a psychoanalytic training in London, which we know London is already expensive as a city. But then you have to pay for analysis, you have to pay for the institute, and then sometimes you have to pay for renting a room, etc., buying books. So it is super expensive, and usually you don't get many young people there. And it happens that there is, I mean, the BPS, the British Psychoanalytic Society, is one of the most important in the world. A lot of historical things have happened there, but you can see in the conferences that they organize every year, the big conferences, usually the attendants are also 40 years and older. What to say about the presenters? And not only is the style of psychoanalytic education in the sense of conferences, for example, that has this style that Aleksandar is saying of like, Freud said in 1905, and that somehow has to be true, even if empirically might make no sense. But also it is the institutes have become a little bit stuck in, I would say, something that was happening 30, 40 years ago, which had to do with theoretical ideas and how you put them forth, etc., without much empiricism, etc. In the case of the BPS in particular, is incredibly special that not in their training and not in their conference, etc., you don't see Bowlby appearing at all. And we could say, well, we have in this channel a 10-episode attachment series, and we could say that of the psychoanalytic theories that there is around, there are many, many. This is one of the few ones that actually has passed the barrier between psychoanalytic institutes and universities, between psychoanalysis theory and clinics and empirical research. It's one of the few. So it's very, very popular in psychology attachment, very, very popular in universities and research, but in the institutes, it seems not to be there, which I find quite special. Difficult to understand, especially in the British Society where Bowlby was a member of. I mean, it's difficult to understand. Yeah, so in summary, even if the three of us have different theoretical orientations, different geographical places when we trained, and different cultural backgrounds, etc., it seems that the idea of training is an idea that has been there for like 100 years, and that includes, as minimum, some theoretical classroom work, some personal analysis, so being analyzed by someone more senior than you, and some clinical work at the beginning that also will have the close supervision of an analyst that is more senior than you. That, regardless of theoretical orientation or the other things that we mentioned that might be different between institutes, it seems like to be an analyst, you have to do at least those three things for a long time. Thank you very much for listening to this video. Sometimes we've ranted a bit, but it's part of remembering our formative years. Thank you very much for this, Aleksandar and Jakob as well.